The rain hammered down on the jungle canopy like 1,000 drums of war. August 1942. The Owen Stanley Range, Papua New Guinea. 500 Australian soldiers stood abandoned in the most hostile terrain on Earth, watching their commanding general's back disappear down the muddy track toward Port Moresby. Left behind. Forgotten. Written off as casualties before the battle even began. But what that general didn't know, what the Japanese Imperial Army was about to discover in the most horrifying way possible, was that you don't abandon Australian soldiers and expect them to lie down and die. You certainly don't leave them surrounded by 13,000 enemy troops and assume the outcome is certain. What happened over the next 4 days would become one of the most savage, one-sided slaughters in Pacific War history. A massacre so complete, so devastating, that Japanese commanders would later refuse to believe their own casualty reports. This is the story of betrayal, survival, and revenge. This is the story of Kokoda. The man who abandoned those 500 soldiers was Major General Basil Morris, a desk officer promoted far beyond his competence, a bureaucrat given command of fighting men. Morris had spent most of his military career in comfortable offices in Melbourne and Sydney, shuffling papers, attending ceremonies, shaking hands with politicians. He knew how to wear a uniform. He knew how to salute. He knew absolutely nothing about jungle warfare, about leading men in combat, about the kind of hell that awaited anyone who dared cross the Owen Stanley Range. When the Japanese landed at Guinea and Buna on Papua's northern coast in July 1942, their objective was crystal clear. March south across the Owen Stanleys, capture Port Moresby, and use it as a launching point to invade Australia itself. The Kokoda Track was the only route across those mountains, a treacherous path that climbed and descended through some of the most punishing terrain on the planet. Vertical cliffs, waist-deep mud, malaria-infested swamps, leeches that could drain a man's blood in hours. And now, 13,000 elite Japanese troops were pushing south along that track, expecting light resistance from scattered Australian militia units. General Morris had been given command of the forces defending the Kokoda Track. His orders were simple. Hold the Japanese. Buy time for reinforcements. Protect Port Moresby at all costs. But Morris took one look at the mud, the rain, the endless jungle and made his decision. He was going back to Port Moresby. Back to headquarters. Back to hot meals and dry beds and radio communications that worked. He would command from there, he told himself. A general doesn't need to be on the front lines. The 500 men he left behind were from the 39th Battalion, a militia unit composed mostly of teenagers and men in their early 20s. They weren't professional soldiers. They were clerks, farmhands, factory workers who had volunteered to defend their country. Most had never seen combat. Most had never even left Australia before being shipped to New Guinea. They had outdated rifles, insufficient ammunition, no artillery support, no air cover, and now no commanding officer. When Morris disappeared down that track, abandoning his men to face the Japanese juggernaut alone, something broke inside those soldiers. Not their spirit. Not their will to fight. What broke was any remaining illusion about the rules of war, about fighting fair, about showing mercy to an enemy. Morris had shown them no loyalty. The Japanese had shown the world no mercy in their march across Asia. Fine. If this was how the war was going to be fought, then these 500 Australians would show the Japanese exactly what happened when you trap desperate men with nothing left to lose. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor found himself in command after Morris fled. Honor was everything Morris wasn't. He had fought in North Africa, earned his rank through combat leadership, and understood that you lead men by standing beside them, not by abandoning them. When he gathered the battalion that evening, standing in the pouring rain with mud up to his knees, he didn't give them false hope. He didn't promise reinforcements were coming. He didn't tell them everything would be fine. Instead, he told them the truth. They were alone. They were outnumbered 26-1. The Japanese were coming and they were coming hard. The terrain was against them. Disease was against them. Time was against them. Their own general had abandoned them. If they wanted to survive, if they wanted to see Australia again, they had one option and one option only. Make the Japanese pay for every single meter of that track in blood. Make them pay so dearly that they'd wish they had never set foot in Papua New Guinea. The men of the 39th Battalion didn't cheer. They didn't shout or raise their rifles in some Hollywood moment of manufactured courage. They simply nodded, checked their weapons and prepared for what was coming. They were scared. They were exhausted. They were furious. And they were about to become the most dangerous soldiers the Japanese army had ever encountered. The first contact came at dawn on the second day after Morris abandoned them. A Japanese patrol, 50 men strong, came up the track expecting to find scattered resistance, maybe a few terrified militia running for their lives. Instead, they walked into a killing zone so perfectly prepared, so brutally efficient, that not one Japanese soldier made it out alive. The Australians had learned something about the Kokoda Track that the Japanese hadn't figured out yet. This wasn't open warfare. This wasn't about tanks and artillery and massive frontal assaults. This was about using the jungle itself as a weapon. The track was narrow, sometimes only wide enough for single-file movement. The vegetation was so thick that visibility was measured in meters, not kilometers. And the terrain was so steep, so treacherous, that attacking uphill was nearly impossible while defending from above was devastatingly effective. The Australians positioned themselves on ridgelines and cliff sides, hidden in the undergrowth, waiting with the patience of hunters. When that first patrol entered their trap, the jungle erupted. Rifle fire tore through the Japanese ranks from three sides simultaneously. Men fell screaming, their bodies tumbling off the track into the ravines below. Those who tried to return fire couldn't see their attackers through the dense foliage. Those who tried to advance uphill found themselves slipping in the mud, exposed and helpless. Those who tried to retreat found the path behind them blocked by more Australian fire. In less than 10 minutes, 50 Japanese soldiers were dead. The Australians had suffered 0 casualties. 0. They had used the terrain, the vegetation, and their intimate knowledge of the track to create an ambush so perfect that the enemy never had a chance. But this was just the beginning. This was just a patrol. The main Japanese force was still coming, and they were not going to be so easy to surprise. Major General Tomitaro Horii commanded the Japanese South Seas Force, the unit tasked with crossing the Owen Stanleys and capturing Port Moresby. Horii was a veteran of the China campaign, a professional officer who had led successful operations across Asia. He had 13,000 men under his command, well-trained, well-equipped troops who had conquered every objective they had been given so far in the war. He expected the Kokoda Track to be another easy victory. When news of the patrol's annihilation reached Horii, he dismissed it as bad luck. A random encounter with a better prepared enemy than expected. Nothing that would change his plans. He ordered his forces to continue the advance, to push south with overwhelming force, to crush whatever Australian resistance they encountered. He had numbers. He had momentum. He had orders from Tokyo to take Port Moresby as quickly as possible. A handful of militia couldn't possibly stop him. What Horii didn't understand, what he couldn't have understood until it was too late, was that those 500 Australian soldiers weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to kill. There's a difference. A massive difference. Soldiers fighting to win worry about territory, about objectives, about preserving their forces for future battles. Soldiers fighting to kill worry about only one thing. How many enemy can we eliminate before we go down? The Australians had no illusions about holding the Kokoda Track indefinitely. They knew reinforcements weren't coming. They knew Port Moresby might fall. They knew they might all die in this godforsaken jungle. But they were going to take as many Japanese soldiers with them as humanly possible. Every bullet, every grenade, every ambush, every trap was designed for maximum lethality. This wasn't a defensive operation. This was an extermination campaign. The second major engagement happened at a place called Isurava, a small village along the Kokoda Track where the path narrowed to a bottleneck between two ridgelines. The Australians had spent the previous night fortifying their positions, creating overlapping fields of fire, setting traps, and preparing fallback positions that were just as deadly as their primary defensive line. When the Japanese assault came, it came with the full force of Horii's best troops. Waves of soldiers charging up the track, bayonets fixed, screaming battle cries that echoed through the jungle. They expected to overwhelm the Australian position through sheer numbers, to push through by accepting heavy casualties and grinding down the defenders. They never reached the Australian line. The killing started 500 meters before they even saw an enemy soldier. The Australians had mined the approach, improvising explosives from their limited supplies and placing them at intervals along the track. When the Japanese vanguard hit the first mine, the explosion tore through their ranks, sending bodies flying into the trees. The column behind them bunched up, confused, trying to figure out what had happened. That's when the mortars started falling. The Australians had exactly 4 mortar tubes. 4. Against 13,000 men. But those 4 mortars were operated by soldiers who had nothing to do for the past 2 days except practice, calculate trajectories and prepare pre-sighted positions. When those mortars opened fire, every single round landed exactly where the Australian spotters called it. Right into the densest concentrations of Japanese troops. Right into the bunched-up columns that had nowhere to go, trapped between the jungle and the track. The carnage was indescribable. Men torn apart by shrapnel. Bodies piled on bodies. The wounded screaming in agony as they tried to crawl to safety that didn't exist. And through it all, the Australian rifles kept firing, picking off anyone who tried to organize a response, anyone who tried to pull the wounded to cover, anyone who tried to coordinate a withdrawal. The Japanese lost over 800 men at Isurava in the first 6 hours of fighting. 800 killed, not counting wounded. The Australians lost 12. 12 soldiers killed defending a position that was supposedly indefensible against an enemy that outnumbered them more than 20-1. General Horii couldn't believe the casualty reports when they reached him. 800 men. Gone. Destroyed by a militia force that wasn't supposed to pose any serious threat. He ordered his officers to confirm the numbers, certain there had been a mistake, certain that the reports had been exaggerated. But the numbers were accurate. If anything, they were conservative. Many of the Japanese wounded died later from blood loss, infection, or simply from being left in the jungle because there were no medics available to treat them. This is when Horii made his first serious tactical error. Instead of pausing, regrouping, and reassessing his strategy, he got angry. He took the losses personally, as an insult to his professional competence and the honor of the Japanese army. He ordered a massive frontal assault, throwing thousands of troops at the Australian position, determined to break through by sheer force of will and numbers. The Australians fell back. Not because they were beaten. Not because they were panicking. Because that was the plan. They had prepared 3 defensive lines at Isurava, each one as deadly as the first. The Japanese thought they had won when the Australians retreated from their primary position. They pushed forward, eager to finish off what they assumed was a broken enemy. They walked straight into the second killing zone. This time the Australians used the trees themselves as weapons. They had spent days identifying unstable trees along the track, trees damaged by storms or disease, trees that could be brought down with explosive charges. When the Japanese pushed into the second defensive zone, pursuing what they thought was a routing enemy, the Australians detonated those charges. Massive trees, some with trunks 2 meters wide, came crashing down onto the Japanese columns. Men were crushed instantly. Others were trapped, pinned beneath branches and debris, helpless as Australian rifle fire found them. The Japanese advance turned into a massacre. Soldiers trying to climb over fallen trees were exposed, silhouetted against the sky, perfect targets. Soldiers trying to go around found themselves in swamps and ravines, struggling in waist-deep mud while bullets cut them down. Soldiers trying to retreat found their path blocked by more falling trees, more explosions, more death. By the end of the second day at Isurava, the Japanese had lost another 2,000 men. 2,800 total casualties in a battle that was supposed to be a simple mopping-up operation. The Australians had lost 37. They were running low on ammunition. They were exhausted. They were fighting malaria, dysentery, and infected wounds with almost no medical supplies. But they were winning. Against all logic, against all odds, 500 abandoned soldiers were destroying an army. General Horii finally understood what he was facing. This wasn't a militia. This wasn't an untrained mob of civilians with rifles. These were soldiers who had been pushed beyond fear, beyond exhaustion, beyond any concern for their own survival. They were fighting with a desperation and ferocity that he had never encountered, not in China, not anywhere. And they were using the terrain so effectively that his numerical superiority meant nothing. For the first time since landing in Papua, Horii considered the possibility that his mission might fail. Not because the Australians were stronger, but because they were willing to pay any price, accept any sacrifice to stop him. And in this jungle, on this track, that willingness to die fighting was more powerful than any advantage in numbers or equipment. The third day at Isurava, the Japanese tried a different approach. They attempted to flank the Australian position, sending units off the track to move through the jungle and attack from the sides or rear. It was a sound tactical decision. In open terrain it would have worked. In the Kokoda jungle it was suicide. The Japanese soldiers who left the track found themselves in hell. The jungle off the Kokoda Track wasn't just dense vegetation. It was a three-dimensional maze of vertical cliffs, ravines, swamps, and undergrowth so thick that visibility dropped to less than 5 meters. Men got separated from their units within minutes. Officers couldn't maintain command and control. Units got lost, wandering in circles, unable to find their way back to the track or forward to their objective. And the Australians knew every meter of that jungle. They had spent weeks patrolling it, learning it, mapping it. When Japanese units tried to flank them, the Australians simply disappeared into the forest and became hunters. Small teams, 3 or 4 men, stalking Japanese soldiers who were hopelessly lost and vulnerable. A sudden burst of rifle fire. A grenade thrown from invisible positions. Then silence. The Australians would vanish back into the undergrowth, leaving bodies behind, moving to the next hunting ground. The Japanese soldiers who survived those flanking attempts and made it back to the track told stories of ghost soldiers, of enemies who appeared and disappeared like spirits, of watching their comrades die without ever seeing who killed them. Morale began to crack. These were supposed to be elite troops, but they had never faced an enemy like this, had never fought in conditions this brutal. By the end of day 3, Japanese casualties at Isurava had climbed past 4,000. 4,000 men lost trying to break through a position held by fewer than 500 defenders. The ratio was almost 10 to 1. It was unprecedented. It was impossible. It was happening. Lieutenant Colonel Honor gathered his officers that night for a meeting that every man knew might be their last. They had held Isurava for 3 days. They had killed thousands of Japanese soldiers. But they were down to their last ammunition. They had perhaps 200 rounds per rifle remaining. 1 or 2 mortar shells left. Almost no grenades. They couldn't hold another assault. The next Japanese attack would be the last one. Honor gave his officers a choice. They could attempt a fighting withdrawal down the track, trying to reach Port Moresby, trying to survive. Or they could make one final stand, use their remaining ammunition to kill as many Japanese as possible, and go down fighting. Every officer voted to withdraw. Not out of cowardice. Not out of fear. But because they understood that their mission wasn't to die at Isurava. Their mission was to kill Japanese soldiers. And they could kill far more by continuing a fighting retreat down the track, using their knowledge of the terrain to create ambush after ambush, than they could by making a final stand. The withdrawal began at midnight, executed with the same precision and planning as their defensive operations. The Australians left behind booby traps at every position, rigged explosives and carefully positioned snipers to cover the retreat. When the Japanese finally pushed into the abandoned Australian positions the next morning, celebrating what they thought was a hard-won victory, the booby traps began detonating. More casualties. More death. Even in retreat, the Australians were killing them. What followed over the next 24 hours was a masterclass in defensive warfare. The Australians would establish a position, wait for the Japanese to advance, inflict massive casualties in a brief, savage firefight, then withdraw before the enemy could organize a coordinated response. Every bend in the track became a potential ambush site. Every ridge became a defensive position. The Japanese advance slowed to a crawl, not because they couldn't push forward, but because they were terrified of what awaited them around every corner. General Hori's frustration turned to fury. He was losing hundreds of men every few hours to an enemy he couldn't pin down, couldn't surround, couldn't destroy. His supply lines were stretched thin. His troops were exhausted and demoralized. Disease was starting to affect his forces as badly as combat casualties. And still, the Australians fought on, impossible to break, impossible to defeat, leaving a trail of Japanese bodies along the Kokoda Track. On the 4th day, something changed. The Australians reached a position called Brigade Hill, another natural bottleneck in the track where the terrain favored defense. And here, for reasons that would only become clear later, they stopped retreating. They dug in. They prepared fighting positions with the last of their ammunition and waited for the Japanese to come. What the Japanese didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that reinforcements had finally arrived at Port Moresby. The 7th Division, battle-hardened veterans from the North Africa campaign, were being rushed up the Kokoda Track. But they were still days away. The men of the 39th Battalion had to hold Brigade Hill just a little longer, had to buy just a little more time. The Japanese assault on Brigade Hill was the largest coordinated attack of the entire engagement. Hori threw everything he had at the position, determined to break through, to end this nightmare once and for all. Thousands of troops, supported by every heavy weapon his forces possessed, attacked in waves throughout the morning. The noise was deafening. Bullets filled the air so thickly that trees were literally cut in half by machine gun fire. Mortars and grenades exploded continuously, turning the hillside into a moonscape of craters and shattered vegetation. The Australians held. Out of ammunition, they fought with bayonets. Out of bayonets, they fought with entrenching tools. Out of entrenching tools, they fought with rocks in their bare hands. Japanese soldiers who reached the Australian positions found themselves in hand-to-hand combat with men who had spent 4 days being pushed beyond every human limit, men who had nothing left except fury and a determination to take one more enemy soldier down with them. The fighting on Brigade Hill was the most savage, most brutal close-quarters combat of the entire Pacific War. Men grappled in the mud, strangling each other, gouging eyes, biting, kicking, killing with anything they could get their hands on. Officers on both sides lost control of their troops as the battle devolved into hundreds of individual death struggles scattered across the hillside. This wasn't war anymore. This was mutual annihilation. When the 70th Division's vanguard finally reached Brigade Hill late on the fourth day, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bodies everywhere, Japanese and Australian mixed together in death. The few survivors of the 39th Battalion, less than 200 men still able to fight, covered in blood and mud, barely recognizable as human beings. And around them, scattered across the hillside and down into the valley below, thousands upon thousands of Japanese dead. The reinforcements immediately began counting casualties, trying to understand what had happened at this cursed place. The initial count seemed wrong. They recounted. The numbers couldn't be right. They counted again. Over 5,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed at Brigade Hill alone. 5,000. In a single day's fighting. Added to the casualties from Isurava and the running battles along the track, the total Japanese losses over those 4 days exceeded 13,000 men. The exact number would never be known because many bodies were never recovered, lost in ravines or buried in the jungle. But conservative estimates put Japanese casualties at 13,000 killed or mortally wounded. 500 Australian soldiers had effectively destroyed an entire Japanese division. General Hori's advance had been stopped dead. Worse, it had been shattered. The South Seas Force was no longer an effective fighting unit. The survivors were demoralized, diseased, and traumatized. Many would later admit to Australian interrogators that they had expected the Kokoda Track to be their tomb, that they had accepted their own deaths as inevitable after witnessing what happened to their comrades. The Japanese never took Port Moresby. The offensive that was supposed to lead to the invasion of Australia ended in the jungles of Papua New Guinea, stopped by 500 soldiers that their own general had abandoned to die. The Battle of Kokoda would become one of the most important defensive victories of the Pacific War, the moment when Japanese expansion was finally halted, when the myth of their invincibility was shattered. But for the men of the 39th Battalion, there was no celebration, no victory parade, no recognition of what they had accomplished. Many died later from wounds, disease, or exhaustion. Others were so damaged by what they had experienced that they never fully recovered. And all of them carried the knowledge that they had been abandoned by the man who was supposed to lead them, that they had been written off as casualties by their own command. Major General Basil Morris never faced a court-martial for abandoning his men. He was quietly reassigned to a desk job in Australia, his role at Kokoda largely erased from official records. The Australian military establishment was embarrassed by his cowardice and worked to minimize his involvement in the battle. Official histories credited the defense of the Kokoda Track to various officers and units, but rarely mentioned Morris except in passing. Ralph Honor, the officer who actually led the defense, received a Distinguished Service Order for his actions. But the recognition felt hollow to him. He had watched hundreds of young men die, had ordered them into fights they shouldn't have won, had pushed them beyond any reasonable limit of human endurance. The fact that they had succeeded, that they had accomplished the impossible, didn't erase the cost. In the years after the war, historians and military analysts struggled to explain what happened on the Kokoda Track. How had 500 militia soldiers, poorly equipped and abandoned by their commander, managed to inflict such catastrophic casualties on a numerically superior enemy? The explanations varied. Superior use of terrain. Better adaptation to jungle warfare conditions. The defensive advantage of fighting on familiar ground. But those explanations missed the essential truth of what happened. The men of the 39th Battalion didn't win because of tactics or terrain or training. They won because they had been pushed into a corner where death was certain and had decided that if they were going to die, they were going to take as many Japanese soldiers with them as possible. They won because betrayal and abandonment had burned away everything except a core of pure, focused violence. They won because sometimes, in war, desperation and fury are more powerful than any advantage in numbers or equipment. The Japanese soldiers who survived Kokoda spoke of the Australian defenders with a mixture of fear and respect. In their accounts, written decades after the war, they described an enemy unlike any they had faced in China or Southeast Asia. Not because the Australians were better trained or better equipped, but because they fought with a complete disregard for their own survival. Japanese soldiers were taught to die for their emperor, to accept death as an honorable end. But these Australians didn't fight to die honorably. They fought to kill, to destroy, to inflict maximum damage regardless of the cost to themselves. One Japanese officer, interviewed in the 1970s, described the Kokoda fighting as worse than anything he experienced later in the war, worse than the battles on Tarawa or Iwo Jima where Japanese forces were annihilated by overwhelming American firepower. At Kokoda, he said, the enemy was invisible, everywhere and nowhere, killing with surgical precision and then vanishing like smoke. His unit of 300 men was reduced to 47 in less than a week. The survivors suffered psychological trauma that never healed. The broader strategic implications of Kokoda were enormous. Japan's failure to take Port Moresby meant that their planned invasion of Australia never materialized. The naval and air forces that would have supported that invasion were redirected to other theaters. American forces were able to establish bases in Australia without facing Japanese attacks. The entire trajectory of the Pacific War shifted because 500 abandoned soldiers refused to die quietly. Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, later described the Kokoda defense as one of the most significant Allied victories of 1942, comparable in importance to the battles of Midway and Guadalcanal. But unlike those battles, which involved thousands of troops, massive naval forces, and extensive air support, Kokoda was won by a handful of militia armed with rifles and grenades, fighting in a jungle that most people had never heard of. The Australian government eventually recognized the significance of Kokoda, but the recognition came slowly and reluctantly. The political establishment was uncomfortable with the story of a general who abandoned his men, uncomfortable with the reality that a militia unit had accomplished what regular forces might not have. It wasn't until decades after the war that the 39th Battalion received full recognition for their actions, that their story became part of Australia's national military heritage. For the veterans themselves, recognition was secondary to survival. Many struggled with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though in the 1940s it was simply called shell shock or battle fatigue. They had nightmares about the jungle, about the faces of Japanese soldiers they had killed at close range, about the screams of wounded men left behind during retreats. Some turned to alcohol. Some became recluses. Some took their own lives, unable to reconcile the violence they had inflicted with the peace they had returned to. Ralph Honor became a lawyer after the war, but he never stopped thinking about Kokoda. He gave interviews sparingly, always emphasizing that the real heroes were the men who died on that track, the teenagers and young men who had never asked for glory but had accepted death to save their comrades. In his final interview before his death in 1994, Honor was asked if he thought the defense of Kokoda was worth the cost. His answer was simple. Every Australian who wasn't invaded by Japan should thank those 500 men. That's what they bought with their blood. The legacy of Kokoda extends beyond military history. It became a symbol in Australian culture of resilience, of refusing to surrender even when the odds are impossible. The phrase Kokoda spirit entered the national vocabulary, representing a particular kind of determination in the face of overwhelming adversity. Schools teach about Kokoda. Veterans organizations commemorate it. Hikers walk the track every year trying to understand what the soldiers experienced. But there's a darker legacy too, one that's less discussed. The 500 men who fought at Kokoda learned that institutions will abandon you, that leadership will fail, that in the end you can only rely on the soldiers beside you. They learned that survival requires a willingness to inflict violence that most people can't comprehend. They learned that heroism and brutality are often the same thing, that the line between defender and killer disappears in the mud and blood of combat. The Japanese casualties from those 4 days haunted their military for the rest of the war. 13,000 men, an entire division, effectively destroyed by a force 1/26 their size. It was a catastrophic failure that could never be adequately explained to Tokyo, that shattered assumptions about Japanese military superiority, that proved terrain and determination could overcome numerical advantage. The officers responsible for the Kokoda campaign faced disgrace. Some were quietly reassigned. Others chose ritual suicide rather than live with the shame of their defeat. General Tomitaro Horii died less than a month after the failed Kokoda offensive, drowning while trying to cross a river during the retreat from Papua. Official records claim it was an accident, that he was swept away by strong currents. But some historians suspect suicide, that Horii chose death in the jungle rather than return to Japan to explain how he had lost 13,000 men to 500 militia. The truth died with him in those waters. For the ordinary Japanese soldiers who survived Kokoda, the experience became something they rarely discussed even with fellow veterans. The shame of defeat, the horror of what they had witnessed, the sheer scale of the casualties, all of it was too much to process, too much to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. They returned to units that had heard rumors of the disaster, that whispered about the Australian demons who couldn't be killed, who fought like rabid animals in the jungle. The strategic situation in Papua New Guinea shifted dramatically after Kokoda. With the South Seas force shattered, the Japanese were forced into a defensive posture. Australian and American forces began pushing north, reclaiming territory, driving the Japanese back toward their coastal bases. The initiative had shifted. The hunter had become the hunted. And it all started because 500 men refused to accept their abandonment as a death sentence. In military academies around the world, Kokoda is now studied as an example of asymmetric warfare, of how smaller forces can defeat larger ones through superior use of terrain, tactics, and psychology. But those academic analyses missed the human reality of what happened. This wasn't a case study. This was 500 young men, most barely out of their teens, fighting for their lives against an enemy that wanted to kill them and a command structure that had abandoned them. They didn't have the luxury of tactical analysis or strategic planning. They had mud, rifles, and rage. The Kokoda Track itself became a sacred site in Australian military history. The jungle has reclaimed much of it, but hikers still walk the path every year, following in the footsteps of those soldiers. They see the ridgelines where Australians fought. They struggle through the mud and rain. They try to imagine what it was like. But they can't, not really. No one who wasn't there can understand what those 4 days were actually like, what it meant to fight and die in that green hell. There's a memorial at Isurava now, a simple stone monument with the names of the dead carved into its surface. Visitors stand there, looking out over the jungle, trying to feel some connection to what happened. But the jungle is quiet now. The screams are gone. The blood has washed away. The bodies have rotted and been reclaimed by the forest. All that's left are the names and the story. And it's a story that refuses to fit into comfortable narratives. There's no clear hero, no perfect commander who led his troops to victory through brilliant strategy. There's a coward who ran, abandoning his men. And there are the men themselves who became killers out of necessity, who discovered depths of violence within themselves that they never knew existed. They saved Port Moresby. They stopped the Japanese invasion. They changed the course of the war. But the cost was measured in trauma, in nightmares, in lives that would never be whole again. The question that haunted many of the survivors was whether they could have won without being abandoned. If General Morris had stayed, if they had proper support, would the battle have been different? Some thought they might have held with fewer casualties, that a competent commander could have coordinated a more efficient defense. Others believed the abandonment was exactly what made victory possible, that it burned away hesitation and fear, leaving only the pure will to survive and destroy. In the end, the Battle of Kokoda stands as testament to both the worst and best of human nature. The worst in Morris's cowardice and abandonment. The best in the courage and determination of the 500 who refused to surrender. But it also reveals a truth about warfare that makes most people uncomfortable. Sometimes winning requires becoming something monstrous. Sometimes survival demands a willingness to inflict suffering that goes beyond any moral boundary. The men of the 39th Battalion crossed that boundary. They did it to stay alive. They did it to protect their country. They did it because no one else was going to do it for them. And when it was over, when the Japanese were dead and Port Moresby was safe, they had to live with what they had become. Some managed it. Some didn't. All of them were changed forever by those 4 days in the jungle. Today, more than 8 decades later, the story of Kokoda still resonates. Every military force studies it. Every nation with expeditionary capabilities analyzes what happened and tries to draw lessons. But the real lesson of Kokoda isn't about tactics or terrain or training. It's about what happens when you abandon soldiers to die and they decide that death is acceptable only if it comes after maximum enemy casualties. It's about the discovery that desperate men with nothing to lose are the most dangerous force on any battlefield. 13,000 Japanese soldiers learned that lesson. It was the last lesson many of them ever learned.